Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. On today's show, we break down the latest on the free agent market, including the one that got away and Lucas Giolito, plus who the Mets could look at next for the rotation, the bullpen, and of course, the lineup. As always, we get to your mailbag questions, so subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your shows. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Elevate your style in a Cadillac. Go from bold to bolder in an SUV, from inspiring to awe-inspiring in a sedan. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. And here's your reminder to subscribe to our show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. If you want to watch every episode, you can on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcast. It's a new year. Happy New Year, everyone. But our message is the same. Please go to sportspodcastawards.com and vote for the Mets Pod in our categories of Best Baseball Podcast and Best Team Podcast. Please and thank you. And if you already have, an extra special thank you to you. All right, it's been quiet for the Mets and the MLB, honestly, so far this offseason. Maybe by recording the show, you notice we waited an extra day trying to give a little news push here and talking about nothing. Just kidding. We do have some good topics planned today. Great reverse jinx and lead to some news. We're trying. In the meantime, I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. Joe, I had to lead the open of the show with Lucas Giolito. That's the state of affairs right now, and it's not just the Mets. It's really all of baseball. I can't sit here and say, wow, 40% of the market's gone since the last time we did a show. It hasn't been that. They're all still out there, besides a guy like Giolito. This thing is just moving at a snail's pace. I think this is like burning incense, right, Joe, where after this episode, it feels like in the next 6 to 7 days, this thing will finally move now that Yamamoto is off the market as well.
Spring training's like 6 weeks away, I think, or something. So one of these weeks has to be the week that the market moves. So if it's not this week, it's got to be next, like soon enough. But what it comes down to, and I said this, I think, on our last show of the year, a lot of people have attributed the pace of this offseason to, well, people need to know if they're getting Shohei Ohtani. Teams need to know if they're getting Yoshinobu Yamamoto. Maybe I played a little bit of a role, but the reality is it's just not the strongest market you're ever going to see. In fact, it's probably one of the weaker markets. Teams don't really want these players, and they certainly don't want to be committing long-term deals to them. So teams are waiting in hopes of getting deals, and the Mets are probably among those teams that they're waiting so they don't have to give, a reliever a 2-year deal. They'd rather do a 1-year deal, a DH, these different positions. They probably want as many 1-year deals as possible. And we'll talk about kind of strategy from here. But I think it's just from the sports perspective, they don't really want the players that are out there. So they're not in a rush to sign them just to invigorate or entertain their fan bases. And that's the state of this market. And next year's market is flush with talent. So it'll probably be a different type of winner. That's just where we are.
That's exactly it. And one of the names the Mets were in on, especially when you look at somebody trying to have a bounce back and short-term contract, maybe defined as a bridge deal, was Lucas Giolito, someone who's had success, obviously, in the American League for a long time. Giolito goes to the Red Sox. This is essentially, Joe, a 1-year, $19 million deal with a beefy player option in 2025, so Giolito kind of gets the best of both worlds for a guy that had a brutal second half of the year. He not only gets good money on that 1 year, almost $20 million, but he also gets the fact if he gets hurt, if he doesn't round back into form, the insurance of a player option in 2025. Now, we don't know ultimately what led to the Mets not trying to close this one with Giolito. We know the Mets are in on players like this, guys that'll take 1-year deals. I don't really think the annual average matters because it's a one year deal, and we know the kind of cash Steve Cohen has. It's the Mets, to me, if they go out and get a guy on a 1-year, $23 million deal that he might normally be a 2-year, $30 million player well, you're paying for the premium of not having lingering money on the books next year, because we've talked about it, Joe. Maybe the Mets will dip under the tax, if not next year, at some point in the future. It's financial flexibility. It's a really smart way to operate when you can. Clearly, this was one of those times that Giolito had the leverage to get a deal somewhere that would offer him that player option. And just what are your thoughts on this one? This is a guy that we've been open about. Not going to be a frontline starter, but he makes his starts. He gives you innings. He had a brutal second half, and there was a lot of circumstances behind that, but he is typically a guy that can pitch effectively for you as a mid-rotation starter, and somebody that we thought would make a lot of sense for this team, and clearly they weren't willing to go that far.
It's a bit of a complicated discussion, but I would have done what the Red Sox did. I would have given him the exact contract that he got. I wouldn't have had a problem. I think the Mets could use some reliability, and reliability is just not a thing in the sport anymore. I mean, gone are the days that there's all these pitchers that throw 200 innings or 190 plus innings. That's just not baseball. There was 5 pitchers that threw 200 innings or more in 2023. So like, people have this expectation of thinking back in time when, there was a flurry of guys that would throw 200 innings. And basically, if you didn't throw 180, you kind of had a problem. Now it's kind of like if you throw 160, that's pretty good. That's kind of the target. So where Giolito stood out is he's in that old school mold of he takes the ball every time. He's going to give you 180 plus innings. That's what he's proven. However, the last couple of years, the numbers haven't been there. The second half was brutal this year. Obviously, you mentioned there's factors that go into that, but he had a fine first half where I think some teams had some pause, and I don't know if the Mets had pause about this, but his fastball has gotten worse and worse since the crackdown on sticky stuff. He's lost that. And I'm going to start talking about this with other pitchers, and one of my resolutions is to learn a lot more about pitching, because I get it, but I really want to get it. And it lost that IVB, which is induced vertical break, which in layman's terms is what people and scouts used to say, the fastball jumps. It has that kind of almost rising effect to it. Giolito had a plus fastball when sticky stuff was around. After sticky stuff, he lost kind of that ride, so his fastball has taken a significant degradation of value over the last couple of years. Is that something he kind of regain? I think so, but I would have paid for the reliability, and we're going to talk about some other targets here, and it's not an exciting crop of guys, and I certainly have a couple that I prefer, but by no means do I think the Mets can and will pivot to some kind of frontline starter.
Right, you nailed it with the reliability, right? Here's the thing with Giolito. You take out 2020, which was the shortened season where he made his 12 starts, so it's still positive. His last 5 seasons, taking out that one, he's averaging 174.6 innings per year. And it's not even volatility where like he had 210 one year and 110 another year. I mean, it's literally 184, 161, 178, 176, 173. He's just a guy that pitches. And why we're lingering on this conversation so much is not that, boo-hoo, the Mets didn't get Lucas Giolito. It's the fact that what the Mets need right now is, you're not going to find the exact carbon copy, but a player like this, because the rotation does have some variance in it, right? Severino on the 1-year deal, which, thank God they got that one done now when you're looking back at early moves. Severino's a guy that he has a ton of variance. When he pitches, typically, he's pretty good. But when he pitches is the key intro there. He's a guy that misses time. Kodai Senga, as much as we love him, the whole rap with Kodai Senga, right, coming over was he's a guy that, you don't know if he's going to be that workhorse pitcher. Awesome rookie season. I hope that's just who he is. But, you can't always rely on that, and maybe we'll see. Quintana, ironically, an Iron Man. He missed the first half of last year, very unique circumstance, but Quintana's regarded as a dude that takes the ball 30 times a year. So that's good. But then you get into Peterson's going to be out till June. McGill, who doesn't work deep into games. The Mets are in a circumstance where outside of the guys you're really going to lean on in Senga and Quintana, they need a third guy right now that you're looking at and going, our numbers are projecting him to make 25 plus starts. Like, no matter how many simulations we do, it comes out that he's going to make 25 plus starts. That was the argument for Giolito. You make a great point, Joe, about the tracking of his actual stuff. It's concerning at this point that he is not the same guy, that you go back to really. I would even look at, that 2019 to 2021 stretch where he was right around a 3.45 to 3.5 ERA all 3 of those years. Like, that's just who he was. The strikeouts were almost 12 over 9. Like, he was a different guy. He was not only was producing at a much higher rate in terms of effectiveness of keeping runs off the board, but his strikeout stuff was a little different too. So that kind of moves us forward here, Joe, that the Mets still have to sign, in my opinion, 2 pitchers. I don't care if they trade for one. Like, you lay this thing out, right? Senga, Quintana, Severino, obviously Hauser.
Adrian Hauser.
Hauser's starting to look like he could be the number 5 very easily in this rotation.
And that's perfectly fine. I know Mets fans are not going to like it. It's perfectly fine.
It is perfectly fine. That actually could quietly be a move that we look back on and go, man, thank God, they got Hauser, who is a guy that has given over 100 innings the last 3 years. But you're not looking to just lean on McGill and Peterson for heavy portions of next year. So I think you need to go get 2 guys. It could vary of what those guys are. We've heard rumors around Sean Manaea from multiple outlets at this point, where you'd have to think, I think that's where we start right here. Manaea is a really interesting guy. He opted out of, I believe, a $12.5 million deal for this year. So for context, he's looking to not only top that, I would imagine he would love to get a multi-year deal. I don't know if he's going to get that. He pitched to a 4.44 ERA last year. He made 10 starts, but 37 appearances. So this is a flex guy for the Giants, coming in and out of the bullpen, making starts. At his most effective years for Oakland, this was a guy that could give you 27 to 30 starts and pitch below a 4 ERA. So what do you think of that name, Joe? Because I'm starting to think Manaea is the most realistic option for the Mets after Giolito comes off the board, if you're looking to replicate that type of pitcher.
He's probably the top of my list, but honestly, it's a lot of guys that are kind of the same but different. Like, they're different in what their pitch characteristics are, but it's a lot of the same. It's like Sean Manaea. It's Michael Lorenzen's pretty interesting to me because he's someone that's kind of still raw in the pitching world. Hjun Jin Ryu, older guy, but a quality left-hand pitcher. Sean Manaea, where he stands out, and I have some concerns that I'll get to as well, but he brought a sweeper into play in 2023, which is kind of a bizarre pitch for a starter to throw. Just the way it is for the other-handed batter, so a lefty versus a righty or a righty versus a lefty. Sweeper is like an optimal pitch for a reliever that's focused kind of same-handed for the most part. And Manaea also has a fastball that has the characteristics of a two-seam fastball, which, again, you really don't want to throw many two-seam fastballs to the other hand because it goes back into the barrel of their bat. Same concept with a sweeper. So he has some concerns when it comes to, is he turning into more of a reliever, multi-inning type reliever that is going to struggle against right-handed hitters and dominate left-handed hitters, which is kind of what he did. However, he went to driveline, and he found new velocity. Now, he was a guy that was sitting kind of 91 to 93. Now his fastball will touch 97, sitting more 93, 94. So he's found an uptick in velocity while not losing much of the kind of life on his fastball, which is a good thing because I think we're going to learn more as we move forward. And this show, I think, is going to transition a little bit to learning about pitch shape. I want to learn it myself and then teach you guys about what it's all about. But gone, I think, are the days where just velocity is all that the most important thing. Like, velocity matters, but what is the velocity? If it's a straight 96, 97 mile an hour fastball, it's going to get clobbered. But you could throw a 94 mile an hour fastball with some life and ride, and it could be a more productive pitch. So Manaea is interesting. I think you're running some reliever risk here, but certainly with the improvement to his stuff, you could see the potential of what he could be. If you can kind of fine tune some of the smaller things, he could be kind of, maybe the highest potential starter left on the free agent market.
Yeah, that's why I'm interested in him, is that at a minimum, he fits the profile of the back end of the rotation on a short-term deal that if he starts to struggle, well, the Mets still need a guy in that Trevor Williams role I always think of, right? It's like, man, Senga needs a day of rest, or, oh, somebody's got a sore shoulder, like we need a starter, or, hey, today we need a guy that's going to get us through the 4th to 7th inning, right? Like, that has a lot of value, especially if it's not on a 3-year, $70 million deal, which is not what we're looking at here. It's not what we're talking about here. I've kind of gone fully into the quantity approach here because that's what's there, Joe, right? Like, Yamamoto's gone. We don't think this team, and we'll get into this a bit more on the mailbag, is going to heavily target Blake Snell and Jordan Montgomery. Another name that you brought up already, but I still want to touch on, is Hjun Jin Ryu, who had an interesting time throughout his tenure with Toronto after a lot of success as a Dodger. I still think he's an effective pitcher. I think health is a legitimate question mark, and I think you can only go after Ryu, who's 36 years old, if you go get somebody in that mold of Manaea or Lorenzen or whoever it may be, because adding Ryu into a rotation that also has a 1-year deal of Severino, you're kind of getting into this mold of you can get to June or July and be like, oh man, we're down 2 starters already. And it's like, yeah, well, you probably should have prepared for that, because as much as you love the upside of both of those guys, you need them on the mound. And we learned what it's like for this Mets team to not have a lot of their rotation on the mound. It sunk them the first half of last year. It really did. It sunk them. They were out Verlander for a while. Scherzer was ineffective. Quintana was out the first half of the season. They were really just kind of swimming upstream with that. With Ryu, Joe, I mean, he still has great command when he pitches. He's still a guy that I feel like when he pitches projects more to the front middle of the rotation. Like, you're looking at a 2 or 3 kind of guy, even at age 36 years old. But when you just look at the last 2 years, I mean, in 2021, he made 31 starts, but the last 2 years combined, he's made 17. So,
yeah,
right. Like, you got to know, like, is this the end, or is this just a blip on the radar and we believe we can get him healthy for a year?
So he had Tommy John surgery, so that's why he missed a whole bunch of time. So he had a specific
something else in the meantime too. Maybe
probably
he's had like a little muscular things over the years, and as a sick fantasy baseball player, I've had Ryu a lot over my lifetime, and it's always the little things. And then you're right, Joe. The Tommy John was absolutely the big one.
Yeah, so when you look back the last couple of years, that's probably the main driving force. Like you said, he could have had some smaller things maybe that kind of led to Tommy John, and then he had the Tommy John, and he came back and pitched well here in 2023. But he was never a hard thrower. Boy, is he a not hard thrower anymore. Like, his
like Bartolo out there.
It's going to be like 86 to 88 is what the fastball is. But like you said, Connor, it's pinpoint control and command. His secondary stuff is still very interesting. He manages to induce weak contact, and it could be one of those guys that it's a different look, right? We talked about that with the bullpen, and we'll talk more about that as we move forward, but it's a different look than kind of anything else you're going to see, especially where the game is in the modern day. It's velocity, it's big stuff. Hjun Jin Ryu is, I'm going to get you with pitchability, and I'm going to locate everything. And the location's imperative for him, because if he misses, it's batting practice. That's the thing. There's very little margin for error. And to your point, Connor, about potential, he surely has potential to be, a mid-rotation type starter for you in 24. But you got to balance floor and ceiling here. I know fans hate to hear about the floor, but the floor is often just as important as the ceiling. If you're only hunting potential, you're going to fall on your face every single time. So you have to have a bit of a balance there.
Last year had me more than ever, like, just give me somebody that makes the start every day. I don't care if they have
Yeah.
a 4.5 ERA.
By the
Just
way, a 4.5 ERA is a quality start every time out.
100%.
If you do
6
six
innings,
innings, 3 runs, that is a 4.5 ERA, and that is a quality start. So it's funny when you think about it in that context, right? Where it's like if someone has a 4.35 ERA, they stink, but in reality, they are above a quality start on average.
Anyone I missed here, Joe? You brought up Lorenzen. He's been another flex guy. He was really good in the American League last year. He gets traded to Philly, and it just didn't work. It's amazing how many times a guy gets traded to a different league or traded in general and just can't get right. It's very, very interesting in that regard. He
was awesome until he threw a no-hitter and he threw 130 pitches and he was really bad after it.
Yeah, that's really the story. That's a fair story with him. Yeah. They burn him out?
Look, what I like about Lorenzen is he was kind of like a mini Ohtani. He was a two-way player. He hit and he pitched, but he kind of pitched out of the bullpen. Now he doesn't hit it anymore, and he's a starter.
We might need him
arm. Yeah. We'll get into DH. But new to pitching in the sense of being a starter. So he's got a fresher arm than most. It's not, the biggest or most exciting stuff in the world, but it would be a floor signing. That's what I would look at Michael Lorenzen as, a guy you signed to be your number 4 type of guy. He made the All-Star team last year, so you could throw that in the press release. And he could pitch, fine as a back end type of guy without being a very high potential. But one thing I want to bring up before we move on away from pitching, I know the Mets are focused on 1-year deals, and I think largely this offseason should be 1-year deals. But when you look at the way this pitching is set up going forward, they need to sign somebody to a 2-year deal here. Right. I don't know who it is, but after this year, obviously you're going to have internal options, which, we're going to talk about ad nauseum over this year. You're going to see Mike Vassell, and you're going to see Christian Scott and Blade Tidwell and Dom Hamill and Tyler Stewart, and there's more names, but those are like the names we usually talk about. You're going to see some of them this year in the major leagues as well, trying to establish themselves. That's part of the Mets' plan. But after this year, Kodai Senga's the only starter you got under control other than the Petersons, the McGills, the Jose Butos, and those guys. Hauser is a free agent. Severino's a free agent. Quintana's a free agent. Yeah, so the Mets need to sign somebody to a 2-year deal. That could be Brandon Woodruff. That could be a Manaea. That could be a Lorenzen. That could be one or two of those guys. But I think the Mets need to make it so next offseason, they're not looking to fill 3 spots again. You want to try to make that 1 spot, 2 spots, and then you could focus on, the top end of the market.
I agree with you, Joe. I think that Quintana one's a sneaky one. Like, that's a guy that's a free agent. You're right. It's just the whole rotation's gone unless you can only play this game so long. We'll only sign people to 1-year deals. Well, if next year's a year that the Mets plan to be all in again, are you thinking that 3 of your pitching prospects are in the rotation? Because I sit next to the guy on the podcast that knows more about this farm system than pretty much anyone. And Joe, you haven't been selling me that. Like, oh, don't worry, 2025, they'll have 3 new starters that are straight from the system and it'll be completely fine. So I'm completely with you. And we'll see ultimately what they do. Let's talk a little bit about some DH options and really just lineup options in general. This market, Joe, is just stuck in quicksand. I mean, JD Martinez is looking for a home. Justin Turner is looking for a home. I haven't heard a peep on Jorge Soler. I wouldn't even think Jorge Soler is still...
I heard a peep about Jorge Soler today in Jeff Passan's article at ESPN.
So we finally got something.
He said that Jorge Soler is probably not going to be able to get the 3-year deal he seeks. If the Mets can sign Jorge Soler for 2 years, they better do it yesterday, today, tomorrow, you name the day. Jorge Soler is the ideal designated hitter candidate for the Mets because he could fake it in left field for a day or two if you need him to, but he has a chance to be the righty answer to Kyle Schwarber that the Mets missed on 2 years ago. Jorge Soler,
I'm with you.
You get him for 2. I am running to make that deal?
That's the one for me. Whether it's the Escobar Canna deal, like that mindset, and obviously it'll be bigger. I mean, it could be 2 years,
Right.
45 mil. I mean, whatever. It may be bigger. I don't care. Whatever. The bottom line is he brings pop to the lineup at a position that the Mets have no idea who's DHing in the next 2 years. So I don't care about this going beyond 1 year. They have no idea. Would it be great if Vientos figures that out? Yeah. Are we putting those odds very high? I would love if that's the case. The Mets have shown us that they don't believe that. The Mets have shown us that. They haven't gone up. Well, Mark Vientos, your time to be the everyday DH. Like we haven't even seen that. So
they had Darren Ruff and Daniel Vogel back at DH and wouldn't give Mark Vientos a run.
That's
so
exactly the point.
You have the opportunity this offseason to sign a real DH. And, I love Mark Vientos. I think he has a future in this league. And, maybe it is with the Mets, maybe it's not. But you have the opportunity to get a real DH, and there's a market of it with a couple other names I'm sure you're going to bring up. And they have to execute in that, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's not a crazy market. I mean, I talked about Turner. We've talked about Turner a lot on the show. JD Martinez, there's some concern there with JD Martinez. The strikeout rate was up, but he still had a monster year offensively in a monster lineup. I would rank them like this for me, Joe. And I guess you could throw Jock Peterson out in this as well while we're just talking about these kinds of bats. For me, it would be Soler far and away number one. Number two, I like the idea of Justin Turner because of the flexibility. If Brett Baty just falls on his face this year, that Turner can give you some punch at third base. I hope Brett Baty has an awesome year because then if he does, Turner's a DH. Like, who cares, right? But it provides insurance that none of the other options do, where we're not like, oh, Joey Wendell's making his 120th start at third base. Like that. These are the things that like you want to be conscious of. So, and then three would be JD Martinez for me because he's just a bat who, listen, I'll take him and I'll be happy on this podcast. But the timeline to me is a very shrug your shoulders. Like Turner falls into the long-term plan of helping Baty and this team now. Soler helps you for the next 2+ years and gives you immense power that we just haven't really gotten to see next to Pete, right? And we hope Alvarez is that, but Alvarez is a kid. Like give Alvarez a little time. So that's kind of where I'm at with the entire lineup situation in a market that's just brutally thin right now, Joe.
It's a real tough market to sift through. And for me, I'd rank Jorge Soler at the top as well. What's really unique about him is for being a really big-time slugger, which he is. He hits the ball as hard as anybody, as consistently as anybody. Doesn't really chase all that much. Like, he doesn't have a high chase rate. He strikes out, but he strikes out because he's trying to wallop home runs, and he swings and misses on pitches in the zone. So I can deal with strikeouts. Strikeouts are not a huge deal as long as it's backed up with some walks, which Soler will walk, or he'll draw, I should say. JD Martinez, similar, strikes out a bunch, but he's hitting the ball hard as he ever has, and he'll draw some walks. So for me, I would go Soler 1, and then there's a gap. And then next, for me, I'd go JD Martinez over Turner. I think now's the time to protect Pete Alonso in 2024, in his walk year, in your year where David Stearns has said publicly and everywhere that they want to be a true playoff contender. And I have some worry when you think about the offensive output of Justin Turner. Leaving Fenway Park, what's that going to do to him?
That's fair.
So I think he's going to hit for a fine average because he's a professional hitter. He's going to draw walks because he's a fine professional hitter. But what if he hits like 13 home runs? Is that as enticing as your DH/Baty protection? Maybe less so. And if you sign a Jorge Soler or a JD Martinez as your DH, you know who you could sign to help out in the infield? Gio Urshela, who is a guy that is best friends with Francisco Lindor, like literal best friends.
Close with the manager.
Close with the manager. Close with the third base/infield coach because he came through Cleveland with Lindor, with Mike Sarbaugh. And he's a right-handed bat that has shown a propensity to hit for average, even if not a bunch of power. And depending on where you look for your defense, baseball savant, outs above average, does not like him, but defensive run saves on Fangraph, love him. So let's meet it in the middle and say he's a fine defensive third baseman that hits right-handed. So I think that would be an opportunity for the Mets to maybe plug 2 holes in the lineup, because I don't think they could sign 3 hitters. Like, I don't think they could sign a DH, an outfielder, and an infielder. So can you have someone like Soler that can, phantom play left field for you when you need him to, until Drew Gilbert or Luis Angel Acuna are ready, and Urshela is a right-handed bat off the bench and kind of your protection for Brett Beatty that you spoke of.
And that last part's important for people to remember. And some people don't want to hear it, and I get it. Like, I never tell you how to be a fan. But the Mets are looking at this system and thinking Luis Angel Acuna is going to be playing on our infield someday. Drew Gilbert is going to be playing in our outfield. Jet Williams, who is having a Francisco Alvarez-like ascension through the system, is going to be playing on the diamond someday. We don't know where Jet's ultimately going to land, but we'll be tracking that as well. So that's why you're right, Joe. Like, you're not, like, you can go out and get 1 or 2 guys here, and impactful guys, not just bodies, but you're also not signing, 4 guys that are here locked into places for the next 3 years. All right, let's close out with the bullpen before we get to the mailbag questions. This is a quicker one, but it's important. I mean, with the Mets right now, this is a thin bullpen. They have a lot. It's thin in the household name section. It's not thin in terms of the volume they've added. We just don't know who's going to make the team. But David Robertson, Hector Neris. I don't look at Josh Hader for this team, although I hear his name thrown around for this team all the time. Like, there's some big names out there still, Joe. I don't know if the Mets are looking to go pay a big-time relief contract when they already did that with Edwin Diaz. And I think they want to use this year to try to figure out what they can get out of a lot of the low-price arms they sign. Like, this just doesn't scream a buy a bullpen year to me.
I want them to never buy a bullpen, ever, ever, ever. It's not a 2024 discussion. It is a forever discussion. Edwin Diaz, exception to the rule. Josh Hader, exception to the rule. But someone else could go sign Jordan Hicks and Robert Stevenson, and good for them. They're good relievers, but someone else could have the volatility that is a relief pitcher for 3 to 4 years at pretty good money. The reliever the Mets need to go for is Ryan Stanek. That is the name for me. If you look up his baseball reference page, it wasn't that great this year. And that's fine. I don't want to sign a guy off a good year as a reliever. Imagine you signed Aaron Loop off a good year.
I just pulled up Aaron Loop's Pro Baseball Reference, because this is the part of the show where I remind people Aaron Loop had a 6.10 ERA in 55 appearances last year. He was unhittable for the Mets 2 years ago. Nobody could touch him.
Yep, that is the way
glad he got
it goes,
paid.
but then good for him. And
nice guy, good for him.
I would love to add guys on 1-year deals, have them have awesome years, and then watch them get paid somewhere else. That's how I would build a bullpen almost year in and year out. My cap is basically 2 years on a reliever. I don't, barring the exceptions, like I said. But where Stanek stands out, go and look at what he did in 2022. His ERA was in the 1s, and he was a setup man for the Astros. And did they win the World Series that year? I think so, right? I don't even know. Yeah. I'm bad at who won World Series. Yeah, so they won the World Series.
I'm mixing up the years.
Either way, he had a ERA over 4 this year, ERA in the 1s, and you just assume it'll probably be somewhere in the middle of that this year. Where he stands out to me is he has that fastball I was talking about at the top of the show. It is mid to upper 90s. It's got great ride that induces a ton of swing and misses. I would probably advise throwing his split change a little less and focus on the breaking ball and kind of make him a 2-pitch guy. But given he struggled in 2023, I think he's a guy you could get for 1 year or 2 years. To me, that's the top guy. And my holistic bullpen approach is, this year is cool that it's, a bunch of 1-year deals on the team. But going forward, that's how I build my bullpen every single year. And David Stearns, there's a lot of things, if you want to criticize about him, criticize as you wish. If there's one thing he did in Milwaukee, was build a bullpen. Milwaukee has always had a bit of a baller bullpen, and David Stearns knows what to look for. And we'll see how, these minor league deals and these under the radar things work in 2024 specifically. But that's a general plan. I don't mind what he does.
You're listening to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your shows. Let's get into your mailbag questions for the week, starting with Dally Takes. What are the Mets' top New Year's resolutions in your eyes, Joe? It's a fun one.
Oof. Top New Year's resolution. Rotation health, because they are probably not going to be, they're probably not going to be coming in with great numbers of starters that you feel you can rely on. Like there's a lot of hope in the rotation. So I would say rotation help is probably a big one.
Treat the DH like a real position.
Yes, that would be a wonderful thing to finally realize the advantage you could get there. And then honestly, another one to me is let the young kids play.
Yeah.
You this is the year as they transition from what was, spend $379 million and pay $100 million tax bill on top of that. So when we talk about the Dodgers spending $1 billion this offseason, that's over like 20 years. Steve Cohen spent $500 million in 1 year. And the Mets ate money on Scherzer and Verlander. The Mets have a $300 million payroll for 2024, and they still have work to do. So the payroll is going to be north of that again. And the only way to sustain this thing is to have some of these young players come up, get opportunities, and become legitimate players. The value of a Drew Gilbert, which him, Acuna, and Jet Williams, I wrote articles that you can check out on SNY.TV, kind of what to expect from them in 2024. And look, if Drew Gilbert ends up being like an average to above average regular when he comes up this year, you go sign those kind of guys on free agency, you're paying $16-17 million a year. Like, the value of having those kind of pieces just sets up the flow of your whole team, and you could pursue the top players on the market whenever you want. So let the young kids play.
This one from Chris Ferraro. I'm really not interested in Snell, but at what rate are we going? But at the rate we are going, what is a contract you think pursuing is not a bad idea? And how is 2025 even a reality? Expecting all the prospects to come up and be all-stars in year one, quite frustrating lately. I feel you, Chris. I hear you. We echoed his last part, Joe, earlier in the show. Like, this idea of, you and I are very mild-mannered about this team, Joe, where we have a lot of patience this offseason, and we still do. But we've also been very vocal. It's probably been the theme of the show that the Mets also need people to actually pitch in 2025. So the whole idea of everybody on a one-year deal only adds up until you do the math and you realize it doesn't. I think that's what Chris is really saying. But I'll kick the Snell part to you, Joe, because I think this is somebody that I would say this about Montgomery. Like, if this thing just waits out and you're like, oh man, like this went way down in average annual average and term. Snell, with the qualifying offer and the fact he still has the kind of resume he does, is probably a deal that I would personally avoid, knowing that I'm still assuming he's getting 5 to 6 years pretty easily.
He's going to get paid, and Jordan Montgomery is going to get paid. Scott Boras is going to get them paid. What he does is he just holds out until teams eventually fold, and they seemingly always fold to Scott Boras.
Look at Rodon last year.
Yeah. With that said, when you look at Blake Snell, I think when we looked at the onset of the offseason, they were talking about, 225, 230 million, and that was probably quite overvalued. Now I think people are maybe almost even undervaluing Blake Snell in a sense, just in the market, not Mets related, just generally speaking. Like, there's a lot of word that he's going to sign a Carlos Rodon type of contract, which, look, I don't particularly desire Blake Snell to be with the Mets, but he's better than Carlos Rodon ever was. And you can't take away the fact that he's won 2 Cy Youngs. But when we talk about lack of reliability, it's a guy that doesn't take the ball all the time, a guy that has only thrown, I think, over 130 innings twice in his whole career. So I'd let it be someone else's problem, but I think from a general conversation, I wonder if Snell went from overvalued to undervalued a little bit in this market to where it's at. But ultimately, he's going to get his, and I don't think it will be the Mets that do it.
And just the perception, right, Joe? You talk about him being, overvalued, now undervalued. Like, the perception of Blake Snell by every baseball fan is like basically gross. Like, no.
Yeah.
Terrible idea.
He walks. Can you imagine sitting through Blake Snell starts?
No, well, that's a whole nother issue. Is that as somebody who is a very sick human that watches, I watch a lot of Met games, and I know you do too. Like, truly, I'm just gonna guesstimate. I think I watch about 90% of the innings they play, and it honestly might even be north of that at times. If Blake Snell was on the Mets, even pitching to a 2.25 ERA, which would be marvelous, could you imagine a West Coast start for Blake Snell, Joe, and you got work the next day?
I don't want to stay
like
up
7 cups of cold brew after that.
Yeah.
The game ends at 4 a.m.
anyway.
Yeah, you're waking up to walk the dog, and Blake Snell just got taken out for Drew Smith. Like that's what it's like. So, but I do agree he's still a really good pitcher that has started to become, it went too far the other way. But I think the overall theme is, he's still going to get paid. It's still early. And the last question I had that it was a little bit of a duplicate of our conversation you just brought up. This was from Kristen Hendricks. Is there any way the Mets will reconsider their stance on not going after Jordan Montgomery? Because I continue to believe that he'd be such a good fit for them. I do too. And I'm a little bit on an island here. Obviously, Kristen is there too. I don't know what the average will be per year. Montgomery is the guy to me that I think would be a really good fit for the Mets on a 4-year deal. Do I think he's getting more than that right now? I do. I think he's getting 5 years. Yeah. Your eyes widen, Joe. You maybe 6. Yeah, right. It's going to be a big time deal. It's one of those things I look at it a couple different ways. The Mets have so many holes in this rotation, and the Mets are a big market team with a big market owner that this is the kind of guy that should not scare you. Because if in 2 to 3 years from now, halfway through that contract, he's legitimately your number 3 starter, well, that's what I want on a championship team. So I'm not opposed to Montgomery like the Mets appear to be and like a lot of people appear to be. But at the same time, there's the balance to it too, that he's probably a really good number 3 that is going to get paid when you do the math like a fringe 1 or actual number 1. And I think that's the thing that teams like the Mets are struggling to grasp.
I think so too. And that's kind of where I stand, right? Where I do agree the Mets need to focus on having a pitcher that's under control beyond this year. And I understand Jordan Montgomery provides those innings that we were talking about with Lucas Giolito and with what the reliability and dependability that the Mets need. With that said, Jordan Montgomery is about to make probably $25 to $26 million a year for 5 to 6 years. He is a free agent at one of the most perfect times of any pitcher I've ever heard of in my entire life. A rough market for pitching, and he dominated this year, especially down the stretch and in the postseason. With that said, Jordan Montgomery is a number 3 starter. And he's going to get paid, Connor, like you said, like a, high-end 2, low-end 1. And I personally don't think that is the best use of resources when I can look ahead one more year. And Corbin Burns is a free agent. Walker Buehler's a free agent. Zach Wheeler's a free agent. I don't really like Shane Bieber, but Shane Bieber's a free agent. There's a chance that you might be able to try to convince Roki Sasaki to come over. Like that's
a big one.
Another guy that could be coming. That one you can't win with money because where he's at contractually, like he's signing a minor league deal like Ohtani did when he signed with the Angels for like $3 million basically, and counting against your international pool. But there's so much pitching. I would rather sign one guy to a 1-year deal now and one guy to a 2-year deal, and next year I'd be prepared to spend like the Dodgers spent on the players that are worth it. Pete Alonso, Juan Soto, those pitchers I just named. If third base is a bust, Alex Bregman's a free agent. Like there is serious star quality players that are free next year, and the Mets payroll opens up a little bit next year. So I know people hate to hear it, but they need to hear it. It's let's focus on the short term. Doesn't mean you're signing bad players. Just means you're not making these long-term commitments to guys that may not necessarily warrant it.
Let me close out the show with a question for you, Joe. If you can go back in time now, start a free agency, would you do the Cardinals deal that they did for Sonny Gray? Because I would. 3 years, $75 million.
Qualifying offer. So,
that's fair.
No. So,
but
yeah, that was it. Like,
yeah, that's
Sonny Gray. Yeah, that's it. Sonny Gray. I thought his contract was fine, and
it's completely fine.
People scoff at the qualifying offer, and I'm done defending it. People just don't get it. The Mets have not signed anybody to a qualifying offer since Steve Cohen bought the team. That time will change.
They want the resources.
But he used the resources to avoid that, right? Like, go sign Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander and guys like that. But Sonny Gray, I think he would have pitched fine here. I didn't believe New York was a problem. I think what he was being told to do in the Bronx was the problem. At the same time, I don't think that warrants giving up a top 50 draft pick plus the fifth round, so call it like a top 150 pick plus $1 million of international bonus money, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks when the Mets sign Giovanni Rodriguez, catcher from Venezuela, for I think Baseball America is projecting he's going to sign the 5th biggest bonus of any player in this year's class. So I don't know if that's the problem with Sonny Gray, was what came along with him. Sonny Gray himself would have fit the Mets fine.
This is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Elevate your style in a Cadillac. Go from bold to bolder in an SUV, from inspiring to awe-inspiring in a sedan. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. And remember to subscribe to the show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch you next week.